Verse 5, he shows that he's going to remove that protection, and now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof. He says, I've nurtured you. I put you in a fruitful hill, and then I fenced you. I hedged you. In other words, God is saying there was certain limitations I put around you. I wouldn't let certain things come to you. I wouldn't let you go out to certain things either. I fenced you. It was for your protection. And God is reminding them that this nation of Israel has been a protected nation of God. It's protection from foreign countries. But also, let's look at it from a spiritual perspective in this nurturing of God. Did not God protect Israel from sin and its devastating effects when He gave them the law? Amen? He protected Israel. Now, a lot of times we look at God's commandments like they're grievous. Well, God just told me that because I didn't want to have no fun. God don't want me to have fun. No, God's hedging you. He's protecting you. Amen? There's a reason He wrote, thou shalt not. Because at the end of it, thou ain't going to want to. Amen? It has a devastating effect. Notice that He continues in 5 and 2. He fenced it and He gathered out the stones thereof. In other words, He removed the obstacles, the molding, the shaping of God, this nation. Oh, when the children of Israel crossed Jordan, they said, we can't take those people. God says, it ain't up to you. I'm removing these stones. I'm taking these people out. And God removed those hindrances. We see in verse 2, He continues, and planted it with the choicest vine. In other words, He supplied Israel with the finer things, with grace. He supplied Israel with mercy, truth, love. And of all the nations, Israel was the one nation that had hope. What a great possession, a finer thing. We see also in the fourth thing in verse 2, and built a tower in the midst of it. Well, what's a tower for? For observation. They could see danger approaching, but also it stood for a witness. For if they were to climb to that tower and look to all other nations, don't all other nations bear God's favorableness to Israel? They could observe, and God nurtured them. We see that He also placed in it a wine press. In the Old Testament, when you see wine press, it was used for one purpose. That was to make wine. And in the Old Testament, where you see wine, you see joy of God's people. He said, hadn't I given you joy? The joy available. We see in 6th thing, and He looked. I love that. In verse 2 He says, and He looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. He was long-suffering. He was patient. He looked. Israel didn't produce, but He kept looking. And for years and years and years, He kept looking. It's the long-suffering and patience of God. We see the 7th thing in verse 2, that it should bring forth good grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. You know, what a nurturing God we have when He expects the best of you and me. Amen? I'll give a hint to parents with young children. Your young children usually come up to what you expect them to come up to. Amen? We've missed that in America. We make excuses for people not coming up instead of expecting them to come up. God expected Israel to come up and be a godly nation. What a grand nurturing. Why do we go through all that? Verse 3 of chapter 5 of Isaiah. Isaiah says, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. Verse 4, he says, what could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? In other words, God's saying there's nothing left undone. God's saying, Israel, I have nurtured you. I've given you everything you needed. Therefore, at the nurturing of God, when they rebelled against Him, They were without excuse. This is the God we need to realize today. He is a nurturing God. Notice Israel's response in Isaiah 1, 2 through 3. Notice at the end of verse 2, in Isaiah 1 and 2, at the end of that verse, God says, I've nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Verse 3, God says, and the ox knoweth his owner, and the ass or the donkey his master's crib, but Israel do not know. My people doth not consider. God says the ox knows who his master is. Even the donkey knows where he gets fed. But Israel has refused to realize, to know, and to understand, and to consider my nurturing toward them. We see the response, their rebellion. No knowledge because they never stopped to consider who was really doing the nurturing. Our response today brings us to a logical question. I want to ask you, has God not nourished you? Has God not nourished you? All right. Who in here planned on being born an American? I'm eternally grateful for this. That my God planted me in a fruitful hill. The nurturing. He planted me in a fruitful hill. And I'm going to tell you, brothers and sisters, for a lot of years, He's fenced us and put a hedge around us. Amen? He's hedged us. Our God has kept us from a lot of the violence of the world. That's right. He has hedged this country. Has not our God gathered out the stones out of this nation as well? Has not God built us a tower? Can we not look at other nations and then look at ourselves and surely see that God has blessed us? Do not we enjoy joy through our Christianity? Aren't we a nation that still has hope in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ? Amen. Don't we have a hope above others in our world today? Has not God been long-suffering to us as well? By the way, you ain't the only one that watches CNN. Has not God seen the immorality paraded in our streets? Has God not seen the immorality that takes place in the heart of men and women? Has God not seen this, and yet has He not been long-suffering and patient? Does God not know the horrors of what takes place in America? Does God not know the horrors of one of the biggest industries in America? And yet He's long-suffering and patient. Does not God expect us to be a Christian nation? To go and spread the gospel and to take missionaries in all the world? Does God not expect us to protect Israel? He's a nurturer. Why do I get wound up on that? I'm going to make enemies. I'm afraid American society's done got like Israel. God said, I fenced it. Israel said, no, we've made alliance with Assyria. God said, I fenced you. Israel's like, we made alliance. Assyria's on our side. Don't you worry about us. By the way, we care more about our alliance with other nations than we do our alliance with our God. Amen. An alliance with another nation won't save any nation. An alliance with God is what saves a nation. Oh, but let's not all get nationally, because the nation's only made up of people. And in our society, are we not self-sufficient? In our society, is it not you that earns your wealth? In our society, is it not you that sustains your family? Is it not you that sustains you? That's our society. God's a nurturing God. Now I'm going to tell you something, brothers and sisters. When we get to see God and all God does do, when we get to understand that God gives you the very breath of your lungs, when we see that God is the giver and the sustainer of life, when we see that we are as but grass and we're that close to eternity, but God refrains us from a day's death. When we see God in all His control, surely we can be like David when he wrote in Psalm 62:7, "In God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength, my refuge is in God. Trust in Him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us." God is a refuge. Brothers and sisters, we need to understand. I don't care what you have. It's the Lord's. And without Him holding it together, you wouldn't be. You wouldn't be. He's a God that nurtures. Let me ask you, is your God a nurturer? Well, sure He is. Just depends on who you think's doing nurturing. Let's be honest. We all live in this time. And most of the time, we think we're the nurturer. Let's just be honest. We think we're the nurturer. God's the nurturer. Second thing that brought about was a revelation of God's anger. Notice in Isaiah, in verse 4, he says, "All sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, of seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel in anger. They are gone away backwards." God says, I've nourished them. There's no more I could have done. And they rebelled against me. And therefore I'm angry. Now notice, God's not angry because He chose to be angry. God's angry because He was provoked to anger. Well, what provoked Him to anger? God is pouring out blessings. God is nurturing in such an abundant way. God has done all He can do, and yet His people are going, we'll have no part of it. And we see that God is angry. Notice He's provoked in anger into verse 4, and they have provoked the Holy One of Israel into anger. They are gone away backwards. Well, what provoked Him? We see their backsliding, their iniquity. It provoked God unto anger. Their ingratitude of all that God had done, their self-sufficiency, their plan and their program, have provoked God into anger. Now, to be honest, this is the God that our world just soon not know. This is the God that men reject. You don't believe me? You go over to Bev's or anywhere else you go this week and you start asking people, is God an angry God? Guarantee you, 99.9% of the time you're going to get this answer.